Welcome to the first segment of APTE. This series will focus on access to clean water. Please remember to tweet your questions throughout the segment with hashtag APTE2013 to be asked at the end of the segment panel. Our first speaker is Dr. Jeffrey Cohen. Dr. Cohen is a professor of anthropology at Ohio State. His research focuses on three areas: migration, development, and nutrition. From the farming families in Oaxaca, Mexico, to the returning immigrants in Turkey, for over 20 years, Dr. Cohen has studied the culture of migration, that is, the cultural beliefs and social patterns that influence people to move. In addition to ongoing work in Oaxaca, he is currently studying the migration of Mexicans to Columbus. Dr. Cohen has authored several books. He teaches a class on the anthropology of zombies, and he has ran the Columbus Marathon 4 times. Please welcome to the stage Jeffrey Cohen.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Amanda for that lovely introduction and the invitation to present here in the APTE Summit. And I have a PowerPoint that should come up. Do I have to? Yeah. There's supposed to be a PowerPoint that goes with this. There's a PowerPoint. Thank you very much. There you go. Techno. These are what we call first world problems. They're the best kind, I think. Anyway, well, thanks again. I'm going to talk about anthropology development and a little bit about water. And what I'll talk about is stuff that comes from research that I've done and research that my students have done. And while I have the opportunity, I know that there are a lot of students from our great university here, and I just want to make a quick plug. If you're looking for great classes in our anthropology department, I teach stuff on economics and development and anthropology, on food and anthropology. We have classes in global health, women dimensions of health and women, women in development, and cultures in conflict. So look us up, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me or any of the people in our faculty. So, development has always been a really interesting issue for anthropologists. It's one that we've been tied to in really intimate kinds of ways over the history of the development of our field. And I don't want to go into a lot of detail here, but you can see how development has really moved in anthropology and in the world at large from a very Victorian evolutionary model, this idea of getting everybody to a certain place to kind of catch up, to a dash for the cities, and through the latter half of the 20th century, the real move to an urban kind of an environment. The expansion of markets and the push of consumerism, and then currently a lot of what's going on in terms of the development of neoliberal reforms and opening up of markets around the world. So this is part of what we do in our research in anthropology, is to look at how development goes through these different kinds of phases and how these phases really influence outcomes. And the outcomes include things like looking at development and underdevelopment, and looking at, for example, development of underdevelopment. And one of the questions that we tend to ask as anthropologists is whether or not the very models of development actually accomplish their goals, or in effect create issues that then need to be dealt with. And we have roles, as you can see, that we take as anthropologists that include siding with developers in a kind of rolling out the bureaucracy of development programs. We work as advocates, siding with locals and confronting developers. And then we also work as mediators, working as interpreters for developed and developer. And I would say one of the most, in my life, kind of had moments when I've done all three of these roles. And I would have to say that one of the most satisfying is when, as a mediator, you actually have that little moment where people are understanding each other across sort of cultural divides. For me, it's working in southern Mexico, watching people be able to talk about what they expect, what they want for themselves and their children, and what programs, NGOs, state-based sorts of programs coming in also want for them. And those are those sort of moments you live for, I think. Water ends up becoming, of course, an absolutely central issue in all of this. We know that access to water, access to drinkable water, is so important. The folks that I've done my research with in the 1970s didn't have access to any water. I mean, there was just, these were little towns where people had wells. There was no piped water. There was no electricity. There were no pumps. There was nothing. And now, not even 30 years later, well, now it's 30 years later, but not even 30 years later, people had piped water, but it wasn't water that you could actually drink. And we were starting to buy things like bottled water. So there are all kinds of goals. The goals sort of always moving forward, bringing people with it. Access to water is so critical, though, in this process because, you know, that access to water and that access to drinkable water or potable water has so many implications for health, for nutrition, for education. It frees you up to work and all these other opportunities. But it also brings up lots and lots of questions. When we ask about access to water, is it actually access to clean water? Is it access to fresh water? One of the questions that always confronts us when we're working in southern Mexico is whether or not the clean water is actually accessible, because it's very expensive. And it can be, in the short term, it seems so much cheaper to just get some, get water, maybe you don't know the source. And in the long term, it may not be. So access to clean water and access to fresh water are real issues that confront us, as well as who pays for that water, who's programming the goals, and how is access going to be managed. And I have a couple of photos here. These are from Bangladesh, where a student of mine about a decade ago was doing a project actually looking at water and health outcomes. And one of the kind of really tough things that he was able to find was that the idea of wealth for the folks that he was working with was in part signified by having a pond. And that pond was your water source. But that pond, as your water source, it was a place that you drank from. It was a place you bathed in. It was a place that you used to clean your bathroom, or it was your bathroom. It was a place you used to clean your pots and pans and plates. So these were contaminated ponds very often, and yet these were contaminated ponds that were the property of people who were moving up the social ladder. They were moving up the economic ladder. And so it poses real important issues when we think about programming and who's paying, what are the outcomes, what's accessibility mean. And this is one of these places where I think anthropology becomes so important, because this is where we work as mediator. This is where we work to communicate between those people providing access and those people demanding access, because they have different sorts of goals and different kinds of outcomes. And the question of equal access becomes very, very problematic, because in every situation, one of the things that we find out is that there are lots of inequalities between people. When we look at a place like southern Mexico, when we go to Bangladesh, when we go to, say, eastern Turkey, everybody to us as people from the United States or from Western Europe, everybody looks relatively poor. And yet you go into these communities and you realize that there are hierarchies, and there are people that have resources and people that don't. And so access becomes a problem. It becomes a political hot potato, if you will. And it can be very problematic. And then finally, the last question I think that is really important when we're talking about issues of development and when we're talking about things like water is what comes next, right? Because once the water is clean, if that's the goal, what's the next goal? Because it's not as though we're done. That goal is always moving forward. And the folks that I work with, one of the questions that they always come back to is what's next, right? What are you going to do here? What are we going to do next? What's next for our community? And so these are really important, and these speak to issues, I think, of inequality that are much broader than any small example. And if we think of inequality, we can start with the idea of equality and what we mean by that. This idea of having maybe the same, right? We all have access to X. Inequality then becomes some sort of limits, having differences, okay? And so when we're looking at places, and we're looking at these places in relationship, say, to our country, to the United States, we want to be able to think about different access, different opportunities, different options, and different outcomes. And again, water is a key element here, because it's not just about water. It's about access, it's about opportunity, it's about outcomes, okay? So we can rethink inequality, and this is another place that I think is just fertile ground for the work that the summit is trying to do. Because inequality is part of the culture of a place. It's part of the social structure. It's created through language, it's communicated through symbols, and it can restructure our very ways of looking at the world. And part of the process of getting beyond inequality to getting towards equality, to getting towards the goals of sustainability, is to reinterpret, I think, what inequality means and how we practice it. So some possibilities are things like recognizing the social and cultural limits of our own ideas concerning development, because sometimes what we think of as the goals are not necessarily the goals. So I can joke about a first world problem, but there are differences, right? There are differences. If the PowerPoint doesn't work, well, that's a big deal for me. But what if the big deal is that I can't feed my family? That's a very different sort of issue. So we need to rethink the outcomes we see as critical then. We need to rethink what it is that we see as maybe the key element in this process of development for a place. And maybe what we want to do is rethink what we see as critical and think about what happens when the local folks talk about what's critical. It may be very different. One of the most interesting interviews I ever conducted was one where I was sitting with a woman whose husband had migrated from rural Mexico into the United States. He had been gone for several years, and she was at home in a small village with her kids. And we were sitting at a table in her patio just talking. And one of the things I do is tend to end my interviews by asking people if there's something they want to talk about that I haven't asked. And usually what they tell me is, no, get out of my house, I'm really tired, you've been here for like an hour or two or something. But this woman, she looked at me, she said, yeah, there is something, it's really important to me. And so I said, what? Because I was just intrigued, no one has ever really done that before. And she said, we don't have any after-school programs for our kids. And here I was, this was part of a 4-year project looking at outcomes of migration for these little rural villages. I had never thought about this. She said to me, all these guys are in the United States. They're all sending us money home. We're not investing any of it into these programs for our kids. My kids sit around and watch TV all day. It's the same sort of things I think we probably hear here. They were just getting computers. And she said, I really want to create programs for my kids. It wasn't about water. It wasn't about health care. It wasn't about education. She wanted soccer fields. She wanted basketball courts. She wanted gymnasiums put up so that her kids could go and do something after school. And I thought, wow, that's really important. I don't even know how to begin with these things. So sometimes we need to pay attention to what people are talking about, not just what we think might be really important. And then finally, and I suppose this goes with what happens once we've kind of met our goals, is to ask what happens once the dollars stop flowing, because that in itself is an issue for these folks. Okay? So this is where I'll end with just some new opportunities. And I think one of the most important is to make sure that as we do our projects, that we listen to the local populations that we're working with. Not because they know everything, and not because they're representative of their group. And certainly the woman I was just telling you about, I mean, she was one out of about 600 people that we interviewed, so she was in no way representative. But because the answers aren't easy, because the goals aren't easy, and sometimes it's really important to listen to the local voices, because it's the only way really to hear what they value, and to hear ourselves in their voices, and to get to those goals. And so it becomes like this older woman. This was an interview that we were doing back in 2002, sitting in a patio. And the man in the hat just behind her had just come back from the US where he had spent many years. And between, and there she is, this is his mom with her walker. And between really just sobbing that her son was home, she was telling us about all the changes that she had seen. Water being one of them, that she actually had piped water into her house. But it wasn't water that you could drink, and that was a funny thing. She said, it's water you could wash your dishes in, but you can't drink it. You know? It's water you could feed to your cow, but you can't drink it. So there's always going to be new goals, there's always going to be new opportunities. And that idea of listening, I think, can be very helpful, because it's really one of those ways to not just hear what the locals are telling us, and not just to hear it because at some level it's right or wrong, but to hear ourselves and the goals that maybe we share. So that is what I've got. Thank you all very much for listening. I appreciate it.